Carter had said the place was a steal. 100-acre ranch for a single silver dollar. He'd laughed, slapping Nolan Cassidy on the back like a man doing a good deed. Place is old, needs some fixing, but it's yours outright. Nobody's lived there in years. Nolan wasn't a man who believed in luck, but after years of scraping by doing hard carpentry jobs and sleeping in bunkhouses, the dream of owning something his own land had taken hold and wouldn't let go. So he signed the deed, shook Carter's hand, and by sundown he had the keys to the Black Hollow Ranch. The wind howled through the hills as he rode up to the house the next morning. The place was battered broken shutters, a half-collapsed fence line, a chimney missing bricks but it stood. The land was good, fertile. He could make something here. Nolan tied up his horse and stepped onto the warped porch. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, dust hung thick in the air like a secret too long kept. Floorboards moaned under his boots, and cobwebs claimed every corner. Still, it was his. He worked until dusk unpacking supplies and sweeping out the worst of the dirt. The house groaned like it hadn't been touched in a decade. By nightfall, Nolan collapsed into a bedroll in the front room and let sleep take him. But something woke him before dawn. A sound. Faint. Not the house settling. Not the wind. A rustling. A shuffle. Then the soft thud of footsteps. Nolan sat up fast, heart pounding. He reached for the revolver beside his bedroll and stood, creeping toward the kitchen. The sound came again from the barn. He threw on his coat, stepped outside, and made his way through the frosty morning air. The barn door was ajar. He nudged it open with the barrel of the gun. The stale smell of hay and old wood filled his nose. He stepped inside slowly. That's when he saw him. A boy, couldn't have been older than 12, curled in a pile of straw like a sleeping pup, arms wrapped around himself, dirty blanket pulled tight. His face was sunburnt and freckled. His clothes were torn, and his boots were falling apart. A rusted tin plate and an empty water canteen sat nearby. Nolan lowered the revolver slowly. The boy stirred and blinked up at him. There was no fear, only resignation. "You gonna run me off?" he asked, his voice hoarse and quiet. Nolan narrowed his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" "Name's Jonah. I ain't steal nothin'. Been here a few days is all. I can leave." Nolan crouched, studying the boy. He didn't look like a troublemaker, more like someone who'd been running for too long. "Where's your family?" Jonah's lips pressed together. He looked away. "Gone," he said finally. "Been gone a while." "Why this barn?" The boy shrugged. "Looked empty. Needed somewhere dry. Didn't know someone bought it." Nolan exhaled slowly. This wasn't what he signed up for. 100-acre ranch was supposed to be freedom, not another mouth to feed. "You got anyone looking for you?" Jonah shook his head. Nolan stood. "Get inside. It's too damn cold for a barn." The boy looked up sharply, eyes wide with disbelief. "You serious? You hard of hearing? Go on." Jonah scrambled to his feet and followed Nolan across the yard. Inside, Nolan threw some logs into the fireplace and gestured to the chair. Jonah sat carefully, glancing around the old house like it might collapse on him. Nolan poured a tin cup of leftover coffee and slid it to him. "It's bitter and cold, but it's something." Jonah took it with both hands and sipped. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out something wrapped in a rag. A crust of bread, hard as stone. "Been saving it. Want half?" he asked, holding it out. Nolan stared at him. In a world that had clearly given him nothing, the boy still offered half of what little he had. "You keep it," Nolan said gruffly, then turned to the stove. "I'll fry up some eggs." By the time the sun rose over the ridgeline, Nolan had learned a few more pieces of the boy's story. Jonah's parents had died 2 winters back. Cholera, they thought. He'd bounced between a few rough places since boarding houses, wagon camps, a few ranches that didn't want him longer than a week. Some men beat him. Some ignored him. None kept him. He'd been walking when he found the Black Hollow property. Just followed the fence line and climbed into the barn. "I can work," he said suddenly as Nolan scrubbed a pan. "I'm strong. I know horses. I can dig ditches and clean stables and—" "Slow down," Nolan interrupted. The boy fell silent, shoulders tightening like he expected to be told to leave. "You don't have to prove anything right this second." Jonah's face flushed. I don't want to go." Nolan turned toward him. "A ranch ain't a place for pity. You stay. You pull your weight. I ain't running no charity." Jonah nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I will." There was a long pause. Then Nolan added, "You got a name besides Jonah?" The boy blinked. "It's just Jonah." "Well, Jonah, we'll see how long you last." That afternoon, they set to work. Nolan showed him the tool shed, the stable stalls, and how to prime the well pump. Jonah listened carefully, nodding along, asking smart questions. He was quick, that much was clear. By evening, the boy had cleaned out 2 stalls, hauled a pile of firewood, and helped Nolan fix the front steps. As the sun dipped below the hills, they ate beans and salt pork by lantern light. Jonah yawned, trying to hide it behind his cup. "You'll sleep inside tonight," Nolan said. "Guest room's dusty, but it's better than straw." Jonah nodded. "Thanks." He stood awkwardly. "Good night, Mr. Cassidy." Nolan looked up from his cup. Just Nolan. The boy gave a shy smile. "Good night, Nolan." He padded off down the hall. Nolan sat for a long time after, listening to the quiet creaks of the house and the distant wind across the plains. He'd come to this place to be alone, but now there was a boy sleeping in the back room, and somehow it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the start of something. The first true morning at Black Hollow Ranch dawned clear and cold. Nolan was already up, booted and in the yard before the rooster had finished his second crow. He half expected to find the boy gone a run off into the hills, or back to wherever it was he'd come from. But as the sun peeked over the ridge, there was Jonah, struggling to carry a water bucket that sloshed against his knees. "That pump stick again?" Nolan called, striding over. Jonah grunted. "Nah, it's working. Just heavy. I'll get used to it." Nolan raised an eyebrow. The boy's coat was still thin, barely hanging past his hips, and his fingers were red from the morning frost. But he hadn't complained. Nolan took the other bucket. "You will," he said. They fed the chickens and checked the perimeter fence, which had sagged during the last storm. Nolan handed Jonah a hammer and a fistful of nails, then watched as the boy set to work. "Ever done this before?" Jonah shook his head, positioning a board. "No, sir, but I seen it done." Nolan crossed his arms. The kid had the right instincts, measured swings, careful alignment. Not bad for someone who'd been sleeping in a barn a day ago. They worked side by side for hours. As the day warmed, Jonah shed his coat and wiped sweat from his brow. His shirt clung to his back, but he didn't slow down. Around midday, they paused beneath the sycamore near the well. Nolan handed Jonah a biscuit from the tin he'd brought from town and poured water from the canteen. Jonah tore into it like a boy, starved for more than food. "You ever go to school?" Nolan asked. The boy shrugged. "Some. My ma taught me letters. Pa tried numbers, but he wasn't too good at 'em himself." "Can you read a sign?" "Most of 'em." Nolan nodded. "We'll work on that." Jonah looked down at his boots. You really want me to stay?" Nolan met his eyes. "I said you could, if you work. So far, you're holding up." Jonah let out a breath that sounded like relief and hunger all in one. Over the next week, they settled into a rhythm. Jonah rose early, kept pace with chores, and soaked up every bit of instruction like a dry field after rain. He wasn't strong. Yeth's arms trembled after hauling hay or swinging a shovel, but he was determined. At night, they'd sit by the stove, Nolan mending tack while Jonah practiced writing on scraps of paper. His letters were crooked, but they were getting straighter. One evening, after a long day of fence work, Nolan handed Jonah a small folded cloth. Inside was a pocket knife old, but clean, with a simple wooden handle. "It was mine when I was your age," Nolan said. "You take care of it. Use it right." Jonah's eyes lit up like lanterns. "You mean it? Still got both my hands, don't I?" Jonah grinned, running a thumb along the side. "Thank you, Nolan. I won't lose it." But not everyone was thrilled about Nolan's new arrangement. A week later, they rode into town for supplies. It was Jonah's first time back since he'd started living at the ranch. His shoulders tensed as they crossed Main Street. People noticed. An older man standing outside the general store snorted. "Well, I'll be." Cassidy brought home a stray. Nolan gave the man a cold stare and kept walking. Inside the store, the clerk, Mrs. Greta Tilson, watched them approach with a mix of curiosity and tight-lipped disapproval. "Thought you didn't take on ranch hands, Cassidy," she said as she rang up the flour and beans. "Thought I'd try something new." Her eyes flicked to Jonah, who was standing quietly, hands behind his back. "You feeding him proper? He looks half-starved." "He's fine," Nolan said shortly. Jonah looked down, cheeks coloring. On the way out, Nolan put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't pay 'em any mind. They talk because it's easier than doing." "Do they hate me?" Nolan sighed. "No. They don't know you. That's all." Jonah nodded, but he didn't speak again until they were well past the edge of town. Back at the ranch, Jonah worked harder than ever. Nolan watched him one evening, struggling to lift a hay bale nearly as big as he was. The boy strained, face red, jaw clenched. "Don't throw your back out," Nolan called. "Work smart, not hard. Use the hook." Jonah wiped his forehead and grinned. "One day, I'll throw it without a hook. You do that, I'll buy you a steak." Jonah beamed. Then something in the distance caught his attention. He pointed. "Riders. 2 of 'em. Coming fast." Nolan turned. Dust clouds trailed, 2 figures galloping toward the property line. He narrowed his eyes. "Stay close." The men slowed as they reached the yard. Nolan recognized them. Harlan Riggs and Cole Turnerhands from a neighboring ranch known more for rustling than riding. "Hayes," Harlan called. "Heard you got yourself a new mouth to feed. That any of your concern?" Cole spat. "Just sayin'. You take in a stray. Don't be surprised when it brings fleas." Nolan didn't move. "You ride out of here while I'm still feeling patient." The men exchanged a glance, then turned their horses. "We'll be seeing you," Harlan said with a smirk. Jonah watched them go. "Who were they?" "Trouble, but nothing we can't handle." Jonah nodded. "I won't let them scare me." Nolan looked at him. The boy's voice was steady. No bravadogious certainty. "Good, 'cause we're just getting started." That night, as the stars burned over the Black Hollow hills, Nolan sat on the porch, sharpening a blade. Jonah joined him, wrapped in a blanket, holding the pocket knife like a sacred thing. "You ever think about leaving again?" Nolan asked. Jonah shook his head. "Not once." Nolan nodded. "Then I guess we've got work to do." The boy smiled. The man smiled back. And somewhere in the quiet dark, the ranch stopped being empty. The next morning came heavy with clouds. Jonah awoke to the sound of wind rattling the shutters and the smell of wood smoke from the fireplace Nolan had already stoked. Outside, the hills were gray and brooding. A storm was coming, and every living thing knew it. "Get your boots on," Nolan called from the front door. "We got fence posts to double-check before the wind brings them down." Jonah rubbed the sleep from his eyes and scrambled into his coat. He'd never known a life where someone woke him up for honest work, and oddly enough, he liked it. They rode out together, surveying the north side of the property first. Jonah had grown more confident on horseback. Rusty, the old gelding Nolan let him ride, seemed to sense the boy's cautious but eager spirit. Jonah had even named a few of the barn cats, much to Nolan's quiet amusement. As they reached a section of fence line by the ridge, Nolan dismounted. "This stretch always gives way in high winds. You'll hold while I nail." Jonah nodded. The wind picked up, tugging at his coat and stinging his cheeks. His fingers numbed as he held the splintered boards steady while Nolan hammered them back in place. Together they worked until their breaths came in clouds and their hands stung with cold. When they turned to head back, thunder rumbled low in the distance. "Best hurry. That storm's not bluffin'," Nolan muttered. By the time they reached the ranch house, the sky had gone black, and rain came down like spilled nails. They stabled the horses, double-latched the barn, and ran for the house soaked to the bone. Jonah was laughing, full-bellied, unrestrained. Nolan looked over at the boy, hair dripping, boots squishing on the floorboards, and for the first time in years he didn't feel so alone. Later, as the storm howled outside, they sat by the hearth with plates of hot beans and cornbread. Jonah, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, looked over the maps Nolan had spread across the table. "You really think we can plant this much come spring?" Nolan nodded. "If the ground stays soft, I figure we fence it off tight, rotate some crop rows, and run irrigation off the creek. You ever had this much land before?" "Nope, but I've worked enough of other people's land to know what works. This time I want it done right." Jonah studied the map, then pointed. "What about here, this patch by the tree line? Might be good for potatoes. Shade keeps 'em cooler." Nolan blinked. "You know potatoes?" "Worked a field once. Man, there made us dig and plant and pull all season. Never paid me, but I watched what he did." Nolan leaned back, eyeing him with quiet respect. "You surprise me, kid." Jonah smiled. "I surprised myself." 3 days later, the storm finally let up. The land was soaked, but nothing was lost. A few broken branches, a downed gate, and some mud. Nolan called that a victory. They rode into town for more nails, seed catalogs, and to pick up a new skillet Nolan had ordered. At the general store, Greta Tilson narrowed her eyes when she saw Jonah helping Nolan carry a sack of feed. "Boys still with you, huh?" "That's right," Nolan replied. "Just sayin', not every stray turns out loyal. And not every neighbor's opinion's worth listening to," he answered sharply. Jonah kept his eyes low but followed closely. He didn't speak until they were back in the wagon. "You don't have to defend me." "Didn't do it for you," Nolan said, then looked at him. "Did it because she was wrong." That night, Nolan pulled out a leather-bound book and slid it across the table. "Start keeping notes. Fencing repairs. What we planted. When it rained. Helps you learn a place better." Jonah opened it carefully. The first page was blank. "You sure?" "It's yours. Ranch has to be managed. Might as well start now." Jonah picked up a stub of pencil. "Okay." The next week was their busiest yet. Nolan showed Jonah how to mend saddle straps, rotate feed stock, and split wood without wasting energy. The boy's muscles grew firmer, his face a little fuller, his smile more frequent. He learned fast and asked good questions. But trouble returned, as it always did. One evening, just before supper, they heard hoofbeats. Nolan stepped outside to find Cole Turner again, this time alone, sitting atop a restless mare. "Evenin', Cassidy." "Turner," Heard from Riggs you took the boy in. That's old news. Got no business raising an orphan on land that barely holds its own. Ain't your land, ain't your business. Cole's smile faded. Just remember some. Folks don't forget what people are. That boy's trouble. You'll see. Nolan stepped closer. You say one more word about him, and you'll be the one limping home. Cole raised his hands mockingly. Touchy, touchy. He rode off. Jonah watched from the window. They're going to keep coming, aren't they? Nolan nodded. They might, but I'm not going anywhere. Neither are you. That night, Nolan handed Jonah a hata real one, wide-brimmed, stiff-crowned, slightly too big but proudly worn. Every ranch hand needs one. Jonah stared at it. This is real nice. Are you sure? You earned it. The boy placed it on his head. It slipped down to his ears. I'll grow into it. Nolan chuckled. That's the plan. The sky turned to fire that morning, bleeding orange and gold across the horizon. Jonah had risen early, earlier than Nolan for once. He stood in the pasture with a pail of oats, calling gently to Rusty, who trotted up with trust in his gait. You finally training him to wake up with you? Nolan teased from the porch. Jonah grinned. More like he woke me. I think he was hungry. Nolan nodded in approval. It had been nearly 3 months since Jonah first stumbled into the barn, and in that time something undeniable had formed between them. They didn't talk about it, not in plain words, but it showed in every small act, the way Nolan trusted Jonah with his tools, the way Jonah always checked on the animals without being asked, or the way the boy set 2 cups of coffee on the table every morning, even if one got cold waiting. Still, there was work ahead. Spring loomed like a promise and a threat. They needed to plant, fence off new sections, prepare for irrigation, and keep watch for those who meant them harm. That afternoon, while hauling fencing material, Jonah spotted smoke on the ridge. Nolan! Smoke! Nolan narrowed his eyes. A single column, rising steady. Not a wildfire, not a campfire either. Too much smoke. Stay here, Nolan said. No way, I'm coming. Jonah had that stubborn set in his jaw again. Nolan sighed. Then saddle up, but keep behind me. They rode fast, wind tearing at their coats. As they crested the ridge, Nolan cursed under his breath. The north pasture was burning. It wasn't an accidental fire, someone had lit it carefully. The dry winter grass ignited like kindling. Worse, the flames were creeping toward the new fence line, which had taken them a week to build. Nolan leapt from the saddle and began tearing at the earth, trying to smother the leading edge with his coat. Jonah followed without hesitation. For the next 2 hours they battled flame, smoke, and choking ash. By the time the fire was out, Nolan was coughing hard, and Jonah's face was black with soot, but the fence line still stood. The pasture was scorched, but contained. They sat in the dirt, breathing hard. They did this, Jonah said. Nolan didn't answer. Cole Turner, maybe Riggs too. They're trying to scare us off. Nolan wiped his face. It's not working. Back at the ranch, Jonah helped Nolan clean a long cut across his forearm from a splintered post. As he wrapped the bandage, the boy looked up. You'd fight him, even if it got worse. Nolan met his eyes. I already am, and I ain't backing down. That week, Jonah worked harder than ever. He rose before dawn and stayed out past dark, mending damage, reinforcing fences, and even starting seed rows with the little seed they had. Nolan gave him space, but also tools, real responsibility. Not the kind of chores you give a charity case, but real, weighty tasks that said, I trust you, I believe in you. And Jonah rose to it. One evening, as they watched the sky fade from indigo to black, Jonah finally asked the question that had lingered since day one. Why did you let me stay? Back then, you didn't have to. Nolan was quiet for a long time. Because I was you, once. Not exactly, but close enough. I know what it's like to sleep with one eye open, to not believe a man's hand won't hit you, to think nobody in this damn world sees you. Jonah looked down, fiddling with the brim of his too big hat. I see you, Nolan said softly. Jonah blinked fast. I never had a pa worth much, he said. You do now, if you want one. The boy nodded. I want one. They sat in the stillness of twilight. No more words needed. But the world wasn't done testing them. Just a week later, on a rare trip to town for mail and salt blocks, they were met not with suspicion but trouble. Cole Turner was waiting, leaning against the general store with a sneer. Thought you'd burned up by now, he said. Shame the fire missed. Nolan stepped between Jonah and the man. That was you? Cole didn't answer directly. That boy ain't your kin. Got no right to raise him. Who I take into my home is my business. Cole stepped forward. You keep feeding strays, Cassidy. You'll lose your whole ranch. Jonah moved before Nolan could stop him. The boy stepped in front of his guardian, his voice steady. You're wrong about me. I ain't a stray. I'm a rancher now, and this is my home. People were watching now. The whole square had gone quiet. Cole scoffed, but the laughter was gone from his voice. You'll regret that. But Jonah didn't flinch. Nolan smiled, proud. They finished their errands and rode home in peace. That night, Nolan tossed Jonah a worn leather vest, one of his own from years ago. Might be a little big, Jonah put it on. I'll grow into it. The next months flew by in work and quiet victories. The fields took root. The livestock was fattening, and the bond between man and boy solidified into something undeniable. Jonah began keeping records, drawing up future plans. Nolan even taught him how to shoot properly, not for harm, but protection. The world might always try to take something from them, but they were ready. One evening, a letter came from the county office. Nolan opened it at the table. What is it? Jonah asked. Nolan smiled slowly. They approved the deed expansion. That southern ridge is ours now. Jonah whooped and jumped from his chair. We're real ranchers now. Nolan grinned. We always were, but now we got the paper to prove it. And with spring in full bloom, Black Hollow Ranch, once a ghost of a place, thrived under the care of two souls who'd once been discarded. They found each other, built something with calloused hands and second chances, and knew deep in their bones that no fire, no man, no storm could take it from them, because this was their home. Together,